Hello, and welcome to Conversations from the Alcove, a series of conversations with playwrights, usually, and theater makers, mostly, on art, the world, the craft, and more, not necessarily in that order. My name is Caridad Svich. I am a playwright and the artistic director of the Alcove New Play Development Program at the Lucille Lortel Theater in New York City. And I will start with a brief audio description of myself. I have auburn-ish brown hair that is pulled up right at the moment in a sort of ponytailish thing because it's hot out. I have bangs. I have bangs, and they're very fluffy, and they're sitting on my forehead. And I have sort of cat eye shell glasses that are perched on the edge of my nose. I'm a fair-skinned person with brown eyes and uh, red lipstick. I'm wearing a red T-shirt. Not T-shirt. It's not a T-shirt. I'm wrong about that. It's a blouse. It's a blouse. It's a red blouse, but it has flowers. So it has some. You'll see, might be some white and blue kind of things, and those are flowers. Behind me is a white background. There's a shadow of a lamp in one corner. It is not turned on at the moment. Our guest today is the wonderful, talented Savannah Reich, playwright, screenwriter based in West Philadelphia. And her plays have been produced all over. Most notably, she has been a McKnight Fellow at the Playwrights Center. It's a very big deal. So we might talk about that because I didn't know about that. So I want to know more things. They've been doing all kinds of work, and some of it has to do with something that we'll get into in our conversation around auto theater, specifically with her play Oedipus in Seattle, which was the winner of the Audience Choice Award at the 2022 Philadelphia Fringe Festival. She teaches playwriting currently and screenwriting at Swarthmore and formerly at the University of the Arts. Sadness, crying. We might talk about that. Oh, we might not, but we'll see. It just makes me sad all around. And she is a graduate from Carnegie Mellon. So welcome, Savannah. Thanks for being here. Thanks for making time.
Thank you, Caridad. I'm so happy to be here.
Pleasure. So as you might know from this series or not, for those of you that have been watching it somewhere in the universe, I always start with the same question, which is, how are you? How is the climate crisis affecting your art practice? You're thinking about it, you're making of it, and your negotiations with the reality of it with your audiences.
Thank you. I love this question. And it's the climate crisis, but it's also a series of stacked crises, right? There's the political crisis, there's the genocide in Gaza, everything that is connected and that leads to this feeling like we just don't really know the future right now. And the climate crisis, I think, holds all of that emotionally for me as well. And I think that this really sort of kicked into gear and affecting my writing practice, as a lot of us did, I'm sure, in the early pandemic. That's when I had the McKnight Fellowship at the Playwrights Center. And so I had heard about it and I was so excited, I'm going to get to just stay home and write. And then it turned out we all had to stay home and write. And it felt impossible. It really felt like I just don't know what theater is wanted or needed, what theater I feel called to make right now. It felt like I can't see 2 steps ahead of me. And so to make a show is such an act of, dreaming of the future, of thinking of this whole event that we're going to create. And it just felt really clouded to me. And so I feel like, and that was when I made the show Oedipus in Seattle, that was about that feeling. That was about the feeling of like, I just don't know what's going to happen next. I just can't see even the immediate future. And so that show is an auto theater piece, which I know we're going to talk about a little more, but is for unrehearsed actors. So rather than having the group come together and make this beautiful thing that we know exactly what's going to happen, and the audience sees it, and there's this sort of artifice that everything is happening for the first time, I created a situation where it actually is happening for the first time. And since then, I feel like I've been much more focused on liveness, much less focused on story, kind of pulled away from my desire for story. The work still includes story, but, and I feel a little like, should I be saying this because I teach playwriting and screenwriting, and I love story, I love everybody's stories, I want to hear them, but in my work, I don't feel motivated by telling stories very much at all anymore. And I feel like, I mean, speaking of the climate crisis and just the way that we're surrounded by noise, we're surrounded by narrative, people trying to explain what's happening in all of these different ways that are clashing with each other. And I think that's part of the interest that I have, rather than telling stories, in looking at the ways we're speaking, the ways that we're choosing to tell. That feels much more interesting and alive to me than the content right now.
Yeah, I hear you completely. I have similar feelings about this, and which is, being in theater and in film, I think is ironic, right? Because it's everybody's telling you all the time. It seems to me, what's the story,
Right?
and and I feel a little bit like I was reading. What was I reading recently? It was an article on. Oh heavens! It might have been on immediacy. Something I was thinking. It was an article that was riffing on Anna Kornbluth's book on immediacy. I don't know if you read it. It's on late stage capitalism, and it's sort of looking at immediacy culture. So it's looking at how people that make art are being forced or maybe because of the times, into a very kind of like, we only make stuff that's right in front of us. You know what I mean? Like it's immediate, everything's in front of us. So everything is, and we can't actually see the bigger picture, right? It's kind of like work that's sort of, I'm not saying the work itself, but that there's something in culture, which I think has been going on for a while. I wrote an essay, oh my gosh, maybe 20 years ago about this. So about kind of myopia that is very convenient for capitalism in general, but also subsets right within it, neoliberalism, fascism, et cetera, where the myopic gaze becomes very convenient to kind of enforce, because it allows people to only be obsessed with themselves and not really deal with like systems, right? So the idea that there are structures and systems that are creating this for us, and that we could change, right? Instead, it forces a kind of learned helplessness, right? So I've been thinking a lot about, and then story within that, I should say, is that, oh, well, everybody now talks about story, right? So advertising, like every wellness seminar is like the story that you're telling, so it feels like, in a weird way, that the idea of narrative has been hijacked by political and socioeconomic systems and structures that ironically devalue story, even though they're constantly saying the primacy of story is important. You know what I mean? So I just wonder if you have thoughts on any of this related somehow, maybe.
Oh my God, yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's like, I feel like throughout my education as a theater artist, also, I was told again and again, what stories do you want to tell? What's your story? And I always felt like this misconnection there, because it was never about that for me. And it wasn't about wanting the world to know about my personal identity necessarily. I'm more interested in structure. I'm more interested in creating an event and a structure for an interaction between the audience and the performers. And even the performers and the work is this interaction that I'm interested in. How can we structure that in ways that are new and interesting, and kind of like are grounding and awakening? The story, of course, like you say, has been taken for its manipulative power by our culture of like, how can a story sell? How can a story deliver an idea? And even in the, classical Aristotelian way, like how can the story like make you lose yourself and get catharsis and go back to doing what you were doing before and not worry about it and not think about things anymore. And I know, for myself as a woman, for my friends who are artists of color, like people are really asking for those identity driven stories. And I feel like sometimes from institutions, there's more interest in stories driven by the artist's personal identity, which is amazing if you want to do that, right? But I feel like there needs to be room for everybody to bring their ideas, to bring their structures, and to have people of many different identities lifted up, but also let them talk about whatever they want to talk about and not say, we're really interested in hearing about where you come from. We should be able to have the dialogue of where we are now.
Yeah, I have several, so I want to pick up some threads around what you said that are sparking for me. So one of them has to do with, so I'm going to reference, was it in, I think it was in Freakonomics podcast. The playwright David Ajmi was talking about his play Stereophonic, and said, well, for those people in the universe who don't know Stereophonic, it is a play, I should say what this is. So it's a play that premiered at Playwrights Horizons. It's on Broadway. It's a phenomenon, and it won Tony Award for Best Play, and many other awards. And one of the things that David said was, when he was talking about his process in writing that play, and he said, oh, when I was writing Stereophonic, I felt like all the theaters were asking me to write about identity politics.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to write about a rock band making music and like the power of creation, right? Like the idea of how things get made, right? But he felt like an outlier. Like he said, I felt like I was making something that who would want to see this, because nobody's programming work like this. So I'm going to just lift this kind of strand up for a second. The other strand within that, which I think is fascinating and complicated, is that there's a pretense, I think, of neutrality that happens too. It's interesting that this is not a critique of David. I'm just using that as an example, right? But there's a kind of like implied neutrality in the fact that, oh, I'm not making something about identity politics, therefore it's not political. And then if it's hypernaturalist, as his play is very much is, then it's even more invisibly, so. And so I just want to tease this out a little bit, because in thinking about, making work that is challenging in its form, or is thinking about the spaces that we're in as things that are actionable. How do you walk through the assumptions of neutrality that could potentially enter into the equation?
Yeah, so important, right? And I'm glad you brought that up, because I don't want it to sound like I'm saying that people's personal identities aren't relevant to their work. It's intrinsically relevant. And I think that what I've been hearing from a lot of artists, sort of like that first quote that you were saying, is just that we're being asked to make that the content, that everyone wants, that what institutions feel comfortable programming is work in which identity is the content. When I think identity, our identities, our lived experiences, our ideas about the world are woven really deeply throughout everything we do. And the content, nothing is ever neutral in art or in any situation, right? And I think it's admirable to try to highlight that, but maybe we're moving past. I mean, I feel like the culture at large is an important moment in talking about identity, but it does feel like we're in a little bit of a teenage moment where, maybe there's a simplicity that's coming in the conversation about identity in the arts. And I would love to see us move into a place of, uplifting different identities, but allowing them to exist in complexity.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I don't want to stay on this question too long, but just because it has so many strands that I feel I need to keep pulling at, which is that the other thing about this that I think is intriguing and especially relating to playwriting is that, I mean, yes, of course, who we are is on the page no matter what we do. It's because it's coming from us, right? It's coming from our bodies, our memories, our blood, everything we've experienced, everything we've read, like all the things, people we met, like that's all part of the work. But the other part of this is that I think, so you talked about this teenage thing, right? We're in this kind of adolescent period and looking at identity in the arts. And I think that, or foregrounding that in terms of content, in terms of expectations of content.
Yeah.
But I think that what I think makes this even more complicated, just to complicate this even further, is the fact that we're also in a political climate that is constantly attacking, right?
That's right.
People's marginalized identities or marginalized in terms of the cis white patriarchal imperialist colonialist sort of paradigm, right? So and so I think that it that if you're an artist, I think that it sometimes I wouldn't say forces, but it feels almost like I've got to say, like I've got to speak to, because I'm being attacked all the time, right? And so I just wonder about like how to walk carefully through merely reacting, right? Reacting to truly life and death stakes, marginalization.
Well, I wouldn't put
Including,
I'm sorry.
no, please go ahead. No, go
Yeah,
for it.
I wouldn't put any of this onus on the artist, right? It's like the artist gets to whatever comes out, whatever the reaction is, whatever we are passionate about saying should be supported. It's just the idea that institutions are deciding what kind of content they want to hear that I think is something that we will move past as a culture. But artists will always I think be interested in talking about identity as well. And, some of my favorite work is, and it should be, I mean, it's so hard as an artist, right, to get that marketing brain to set that down and to say, I'm not trying to write what I think people will like. I'm not trying to please anybody. I'm trying to say what I want to say and create the room I want to be in. And if that room is reacting to, very, very real oppression coming from all sides, maybe it does end up being about identity, maybe it doesn't. I think it's in the work either way because that's the air we breathe. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. Absolutely. I wanted to shift to, you touched on this a little bit in your intro, so I wanted to bring this back. Creation of OEDIPUS in Seattle and working in the realm of auto theater, which some people in our imaginary audience, you are a real audience, I know you're there, may know about, may not know about, may not know what this is, or may not have very little reference to it. So how the project came to be, you talked a little bit about that, but maybe explain it to our audience, and also what new work that you're making in this realm or adjacently. Yeah.
Thank you. And I know this is a shared interest of ours, and you're looking at auto theater in your work as well. So this is something we've connected on. But auto theater, I mean, maybe you can help me out with the actual definition. My understanding is that it's work that the performer comes in with no rehearsal and no direction, and the show works like a machine and just guides them through. And that can either have an audience watching, or the performer can also be the audience. And the interaction with the sort of machine of the play can be the piece itself. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds right, and it's usually work that's instruction-based,
Instruction based, right?
right?
So it was
Right,
like a four, yeah,
yeah, you
sort of,
get like, "Here's your first instruction, go
yeah,
do this, here's your next one."
mhm,
Yeah,
the performance score,
yeah,
maybe, yeah, yeah. So task based, all of that is really exciting to me as the anti-story and pro task based theater is. I've been thinking about a lot. I mean, I got into it. I used to do a lot of audience interactive theater, and in order to get that sort of liveness and that task-based quality, but in recent, I mean, partially because I wrote this during the early pandemic, and I just couldn't imagine there being an audience, so I shifted away from the audience. But um, also because I think you're never totally it's hard to keep the audience totally safe with audience interaction. I try so hard, I think about it so much and never putting anyone on the spot. But if someone just feels put on the spot, I think it's pretty important to protect our poor audiences who have given up their time and are sitting there quietly watching our show. So I was looking at how to get this same sort of risky feeling. And I think the audience is so empathetic to the unrehearsed actor. We imagine ourselves in their shoes because it's such a frightening and visceral idea of being on stage and not knowing what's going to happen next, especially since we have this sort of history of seeing actors who know what's going to happen and we don't know what's going to happen. So when they don't know and we don't know, the audience and the actor are exactly on the same plane. So it creates this, I think, heightened empathy for them. Um, and in that show, the show is a mashup of Oedipus and Sleepless in Seattle. So it's all about destiny. It's all about not knowing what's going to happen next and having to go through life, without the comfort of feeling like you have a destiny, feeling like the gods have fated you. I think that that's what ancient Greek tragedy and modern romantic comedy have in common is this sort of either actual belief or desire to believe that we're running on tracks of some kind and not just freely floating through our world and our lives. Um, so it was a series of tasks that sort of engaged with those two stories, and the actors wore headphones the whole time and heard instructions in ear through the headphones and also heard instructions overhead. So sometimes the audience could hear the instructions and sometimes not. And sometimes they would read a script. And that piece was really like a lab. It was different forms of the instructions and seeing what was fun, seeing what was generative. Um, and then the new piece that I'm working on now, generously commissioned by the Lortel Alcove, what was called "What Is the Butt Game?" Question mark. What is the butt game? And it also has unrehearsed actors. There's one rehearsed actor and three unrehearsed. So we're kind of adding in live direction. And the rehearsed actor will be telling the other actors what to do. And I'm hoping that because we have that one rehearsed actor, we can add a little more play. It was so task based, the one before, they almost didn't even really need actors. It could have been just a person. But I got such amazing actors to do it. And I was like, oh, I want to let them play more this time. I want to let actors be actors and do what they do. So I'm experimenting with giving them a little more rope this time.
yeah, that's really awesome. In your teaching, do you bring this work into your teaching practice at all, or are you like, here's my syllabus and I have to cover, all the forms of drama first before I deal with audience interaction, but also not just audience interaction, but the idea of task-based theater, task-based performance, really, and so. Yeah, so I wonder how this floats into your teaching practice, if at all.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think when I'm teaching something like screenwriting or intro to playwriting, it doesn't really apply, but it is totally infused also. For one thing, the classroom is so much more like creating task-based theater or audience interactive theater. than I really had thought before I started teaching. I mean, we have an audience come in, we're in control of their experience, and I'm creating a series of tasks for them to interact with me, to interact with each other, to interact with information. And I want them to feel a certain way. I want them to take things in, and I want to create a certain feeling in the room, right? So just like a play, I think the classroom is a machine that we have to build to produce, the feeling that we're looking for. And I'd like both the audiences and the students to feel empowered and awakened, I guess, by that experience. And they both have a tendency, because of the ways these have worked historically, to feel removed and want to go to sleep. So, and you have to push against that history of, boring teaching, boring theater, where the audience or the student's experience isn't considered. And so that's like the way I think that it comes into my teaching the most is when I talk about playwrights' work, when I talk to students about their work, I'll always try to bring it back to like, what is the audience experiencing right now? Like we have to look inside and think about what we want to say, but we also want to know it's communication. And if you were to bring a friend into a conversation where they talk to you for an hour and you talk the whole time and they don't say anything, you have to be so compassionate to them and think about what they need, if they're going to know where the bathroom is, if they're going to know what their ability to move around is, and also just be really thoughtful about how each piece of content and how the flow of one thing to another is going to feel to them. So reframing everything as the audience experience, I think, is how I bring that in, even into really traditional narrative script-based theater.
Yeah, which makes total sense, and I think that often is not taught that way. By the way, usually plays are treated like closed systems that are viewed and kind of, and then there they are, and we have nothing to do. I mean, we're sort of almost not tangential to the experience, but the audience becomes merely a spectator,
Right.
with no agency around their spectatorship. So yeah, but thinking through plays and how they're activating the audience, rather than just existing and the audience happens to be there. I think those are two different kinds of plays, right? And I think, and there are plays that just want the audience to just show up and be there and goodbye afterwards, but it's not the most exciting. This thing of sleeping, though, I'm kind of being mischievous right now, but I want to sort of talk about it for a second, which is that I think, so I'm kind of fascinated, and maybe there was a piece that did this not so long ago, where the audience came in and their task was to sleep.
Mm,
That the piece was about sleeping. The piece
that's
was
so
about
nice.
sleeping, and that I think they wore headphones, and something was being kind of like a text or something was sort of being relayed to them as they were put in a kind of like sleep-like or actual sleep state. And
That,
I thought a lot about that piece recently because I was thinking about how vulnerable you are when you're sleeping, that there is something quite exposed about that state, but also that, just to flip this a little bit, that sometimes people are shamed for sleeping at the theater. And I'm just like, sometimes I'm like, that's the most honest response you can have.
that's right.
Like literally it could be that you've had an incredibly long day and suddenly being in a darkened space, if it's a darkened space, that you just feel like this is probably the most rest I'll ever get for the day, right? And so and I feel like that's so awesome, and not that I know that performers don't like it, and obviously other audience members don't like it, but that's okay. But then the other part of it is if the work is legitimately boring,
Right.
that is a legitimate response to go
Yeah.
to sleep, and so so I don't want to be like, like we should all sleep at the theater, but I do think there's something around honoring the audience response,
Right.
however they respond. And because I think there's a lot of shame attached to being in an audience. And I think that that's actually what drives people away from the theater, to be honest, because they've been shamed in the past, or they've been called out for not behaving. This whole question of etiquette in theater, but also the idea that you're not reacting the way you're supposed to react. Some of this having to do with not understanding neurodivergence. So yeah, so I guess I just want to bring this up, and maybe it provokes something in you. I don't know. I thought it might. So let's
Oh
see.
yeah. Oh yeah. No, I think about that a lot. I mean, the audience being invited to be there as human beings is so important, right? And not being like, I think a lot of us have that, like, somebody took us to the Nutcracker in 3rd grade and we had to like dress up and wear the like lace collar, and you were too hot, and you it was like, you better not. This wasn't my parents, but this is just like an experience a lot of us share, is that the theater is this um it's for the elite. If you go, you have to act polite, and you're gonna get in trouble, and it's not for you to relax at all. You have to be perfectly still and pretend you don't exist. And that's, nobody really wants to have that relationship with theater, I think. And creating theater where you can't have that relationship is important to me. That just sort of makes it really, really clear and flags that this doesn't happen without the audience. We're in the room together. The audience is a huge, huge part of it. And yeah, and I mean, I just in a smaller way, I'm someone who laughs at the theater really loud. And my boyfriend gets really embarrassed and he's like, it's not supposed to be funny. And I'm always like, well, it was funny. That was my reaction. And that's like, I don't feel like is disrespectful. It's actually respectful to be bringing in my real response, and I'd like people to bring that to my work too. And if they fall asleep, they fall asleep, just like you said.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's something to push back against in the theater. People might feel comfortable in theater, and when I was younger, I was doing theater almost exclusively outside of the theater scene and in the punk scene, and we would do our shows in music venues and stuff like that. And so I was always getting people, I heard it again and again, people saying, I've never seen a play before, or I only saw a play when I was a kid, and I was really uncomfortable and I thought plays were stupid, but this was cool. And like having that engagement of like, what is a play that someone who doesn't see plays can see and be made to feel welcome, and like this is just like anything else. You can bring your humanity.
Yeah, I think there's something about, I love this remark that you just made around, oh, I went to see a play once and it's not like for me, right? Like I didn't know what this was. And, I hadn't seen a play since I was 5 years old, that the pageant at school or whatever. And obviously that's different in different countries and in different cities and in different how people react, where theater even intersects with the community. Some communities, not at all. And so, but there is a kind of like, I saw that thing and it looked stupid, or, that you just said. And I was like, it's so fascinating. It might be interesting to kind of talk to audiences about what their first theater experiences were.
Oh my
you
God.
know,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what they bring, from you're saying Nutcracker, and off we went. I remember going to the Nutcracker and like getting all dressed up too, and like it being a big deal. It was a huge deal. It was like, had to get dressed up, and you had to like, and for my parents and I, it was like we had to travel, like it was like an hour away or an hour and a half away. And so there was like this whole thing of like anticipation, getting to the venue, the kind of being there, surrounded by people, and it wasn't like super fancy, but you got dressed up, and
Yeah.
or the thing, right? And And then, the ballet started and it was like very exciting and like all those things. But then it was like the ride back. Like I always think about the ride back after the ballet because I was like, oh, wow. Like, I kept thinking about it and wanting to talk about it. Um, but also there was that feeling of like, how where theater experience stays with you, right? Like where you're like, the beautiful thing about it is that you carry it with you. You carry it home, right? And it's in your bones somewhere. Like I remember, like right away, I was like, I want to get I was like obsessed. I was like, I want to get the like record. I want to get the Tchaikovsky, and I want to listen to it, and I want to like study the music. I was really interested in like the musical gestures in it, and I just bothered my parents endlessly about the recording, and so I think I bring this up because I think you might see where I'm headed with this, but that there's sometimes a divorce that happens in a lot of theater people where they think that the live event has no relationship to the things that come after it or the things that are a part of it. To me, there's the live event, but also the recording or a recording is part of that same experience.
Yeah.
So for me, getting like when I talked to David Greenspan once and he was talking about, he was in California with his family, and his first relationship to theater was listening to original cast recordings from Broadway musicals.
Yeah.
And like that was he couldn't see the show, so he could hear this cast album, right? And that was the first entry point. And so I think about the relationship between live performance, something that is recorded, whether it be a cast album, whether it be a performance capture, a broadcast, however that manifests, that those are things that we carry with us, whether we have direct relationship to it, like seeing the show and then buying the record or like whatever, but just like you would with music, right? A concert and then you have the recording, if you're so lucky, or you're streaming it on Spotify or other platforms. And so I think just theater sometimes pretends that relationship doesn't exist.
Yeah, totally. And something that sparked for me about this story is like that thing about the Nutcracker. Like I think at one point I would have said, in the past I would have said like I don't like that, the big theater productions, I only want like the theater of the people and like it's cheap and we show up in shorts and we're drinking beer, and I love that and it's so special. But I feel like we need it all. Like I also want there to be the specialness of that experience and the one that you get dressed up for, and that is all of these artists giving so many hours of focus and their lives of training to be able to get to that point. I think most theater people have a story about, a special production like that they'll remember. And I remember seeing a production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf at the Guthrie when I was in high school, when I was in like 9th grade, that had Patrick Stewart and Mercedes Ruehl. And it's nothing like the theater I make at all, but like I can see it in my head right now because of the intensity of attention that I had on that show. And that's, that's really important to me too. The whole range of productions.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did you get into playwriting? This is an odd field to get into, can I just say? So what made you? We're misfits, Why do we do this strange thing? So how did you get into it? What was the spark?
I think I just didn't know how odd it was, and it was a rude awakening later. But my parents had both worked in theater, had moved to Minneapolis to work at the Guthrie, where my mother was a scenic painter and my father was prop master, and they both eventually left and went into fine arts and decorative arts, but always sort of would go see shows. And I think there was something that just seemed like normal to me about it, and therefore I don't really have a great answer to how I got into it. Like I don't remember this, but I'm told I wrote a play in 2nd grade and my 2nd grade class performed it. So I think it just seemed like a regular thing that a person might do to me. but certainly have tried to stop doing it, and it pulls you back.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of stopping doing it, I mean, I think this circles back, I think, to the climate crisis question, and reality, right? So, you know, the idea of the, I mean, it's interesting because I think and it is part of a poly crisis, but I always think about the Mark Fisher quote around this. I'm going to paraphrase it, but we're basically what late stage, end stage, whatever stage, call it capitalism, all of it basically, has done in its acceleration is sold us the idea that there is no future. That the idea is that all we have is what is here, and it's the best, right? Because it's sort of ideological, right? It's sort of saying capitalism is default, and you can't imagine anything else, and there's no future. There's no future because you have to believe in capitalism. You can't believe something an alternate to this system, right, that we're in. But also he talked about it in relationship to the arts because he was a music critic. And he talked about this concept of nostalgia, right? So that kind of like what he saw how it was manifesting in terms of their creation of music was, especially kind of widely available music, was an emphasis on retro, right? A sort of like, I wanted to sound like the 1980s. I wanted to sound like whatever. And he said, why would you do that? Unless you're doing kind of an exploration of like the actual like instrumentation and like, you know what I mean? Like why in heaven's name would you want to do that as an artist? Like I want to make something that sounds exactly like what it was like in 1980. You know what I mean? Like what? Like that's bananas, right? But he related that to the idea of like when you don't see a future, you start to kind of only be in a kind of hall of mirrors with the past, right? You sort of start to kind of think that all you can do is kind of take from, past forms and past ways of making and doing sounding, right? The idea of an actual new sound is incredibly rare, right? Yeah. The idea of a new sound has been foreclosed. So I wonder if anything sparks in you from this.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about. I don't hear that as much in theater, right? You don't hear people saying, I want it to feel like classic. I mean, I suppose that's the status quo is doing theater. There's this idea of correctness and learning to do things the way it should be, but not as much of an idea of retro, but we get that very much in music. I feel really motivated by the future in art. I feel really motivated. I mean, where I want to exist in each project is, I don't know how to do this. And I've reached that moment with the project I'm working on now. And I'm like, oh, this is horrible. I hate this. Why do I do this? I should do something I know how to do. But I do think I end up looking in each project for a way to change it so that I can always be on the edge of my own knowledge and on the edge of my own comfort. And so, yeah, for whatever reason, I am very much pushed to find that space. And it does feel like, I mean, I'm sparked by looking at art and capitalism, of course, because I think by always trying to find that future, I do ensure that my art isn't, it's not the way to be the most successful, right? It's like, because you're not saying, great, I did that, let me make another one. People will understand I'm the person who does this. You know what you're getting. And it's, to me, art is one of the few things that successfully lives outside of capitalism, that isn't for anything, that isn't a one-to-one trade with anything else. I had a student, this is getting a little off topic to your question, I hope that's okay, but I had a student recently who's writing a play, and they came to me and they're like, "I'm stuck. What's the role of the artist in society? I'm worried this piece isn't political enough. I'm worried that, am I not fulfilling my duty as an artist to change the world, and talk about politics?" And it was so interesting because I was like, well, I don't think that artists do have a duty. We have a duty as human beings, but I think that there is, again, if you are called to make political work, you should, but also art as something that isn't for anything, doesn't drive capitalist engines, is already inherently political to me, is already inherently giving your life in the service of something other than accruing wealth, other than supporting the status quo, and already lives outside of those structures. And I don't know, they found their way through it. I mean, I felt like I really identify with that. I think a lot of us do.
Yeah, I know. And I think that there is something around, wanting the work to matter. I think it comes from that, right? It's sort of like, there's this interesting question around import and importance, right? So how important is the work? And sometimes you can't predict that, for one thing. And I think that it's such an incredibly heavy burden to write under the assumption that it will be important. But because, that's sort of out of your hands, really, to be honest, whether it strikes a chord, whether it hits a nerve, all the things, culturally, the zeitgeist, etc. Sometimes it's just a matter of when something is produced and
Right.
for whatever reason, people cotton to it or not. But I do understand it. I do understand it from like a student, because it's tied to this idea of like, I wanted to mean something. You know what I mean? Like that there's a beautiful, genuine, I think, desire for, especially I think in a country where art making is, not supported.
That's right.
And generally not talked about very much outside of box office number. You know what I mean? Outside of like literally numbers, right? So it doesn't feel like it's part of the fabric of society in the same way. And so I understand when a student says, what am I doing? Like, how do I want it to mean something, because everywhere around me tells me it has no meaning.
Yes.
And so I think you have to sort of fight. You have to fight for it to have meaning a little bit. I think that's unique, I think, to the US, and I don't see it in other countries where art is valued, so I think it makes US artists from the get-go kind of function a little bit differently, because the assumption is not going to be supported, not going to be cared about, only be valued in terms of our numbers.
That's right. Yeah. And even if it is a political work, of course, you can't exchange that for this much political art equals this much political change. You're still functioning in the realm of emotions and communication, and it's more about what do we need to process our lives as humans, rather than this art is itself a weapon. I don't think that that's not a generative way to think about political art for me, although it is for some people, for sure. But yeah, definitely, I think that it's something that I'll keep wrestling with, and I think the student will keep wrestling with too.
Yeah, I was thinking about I don't know if you saw it, I'm sure you did, but there was a clip online, sort of, of the company of hair, the original company of hair, performing here, like on some TV show, and whatever year it was, maybe at the Tonys. Could it have been at the Tony Award? Okay, so but like the original company, not the revival. And somebody was remarking, was saying, "My gosh, they really believe." Do you know what I mean? Like they were really protesting. It like was genuine. It was like, yes, and we're angry about this, and boom, and we're feel, and it hurts, and I want to show you that, and I want to express that. And it was the remark, and I can't remember who it was, but they said, "Oh wait, that seems so. We don't have. Where is that? In our theater, right?" And I was thinking, where is that? Where, like in a sense, hair was a commercial product.
Yeah, I mean, hugely.
Right?
Yeah.
Hugely, like it did really well.
Yeah.
It did really well. And yet, but it was suffused with this, like, absolutely, let's call to action, let's get out in the street, let's make something, let's feel stuff, let's feel something big.
Yes.
Right? I think is different from what I've seen, and this is just a mini trend that I've been noticing, and maybe it will turn into something else, but I've been noticing a kind of mini trend in US playwriting that's been very inward, that's been very kind of like, I just here my little space, I'm feeling things by myself. And there's and that sort of this feeling that the work can be galvanizing is kind of taken, and I think it's related to this question of, well, it doesn't matter because it doesn't mean anything because there's no value. Do you know what I mean? So that everything goes inward.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know, like this relationship to inward and outward when we make work, outward, like outward looking, outward facing, even though we do public facing work, time-based work, how do we, and it doesn't mean that it devalues the idea of thinking about interiority, which I think is really important. But I think that there's this balance that needs to be struck in making plays, making performance, where these things are held in tension and coexistence with one another. So, and I thought maybe you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting, and it makes me wonder if we'll swing the other way, if that's a pendulum, and we are in a really interesting moment of like re-examining the interior right now in theater, I feel like. And I don't know, I guess I like to, it's different for every maker what feels motivating to think about. And for me, it feels motivating to think about what can I control? Control feels like a harsh word, but I do think, what can I control? This space and how people are treated in this space, in the rehearsal room, in performance. How is the audience treated? What is the relationship? And does the audience feel that they are being treated as equals to everyone involved in the piece, as people who might be going to make their own piece, right? Which they often are, because only artists see art. But this feeling of if we can create a space that is the kind of space we would like to be audience members or participants in, that's something I can do. And that's something that, whether or not it can reverberate out and change what happens outside of that room is a little bit out of my control. And I think a lot of people do make exciting like protest work. As you're saying, it's not really like a happening thing right now, but also of course like film and television is trying to sort of take current protest movements and co-opt them and use them to make money. So that's sort of a complicated thing right now too. And what feels radical to me is spaces that aren't about the impact, that aren't about like what is this worth, and saying this piece is of inherent worth. This art is of inherent worth, like a human being. Like it doesn't have to be like, what do you have to do? What do you have to prove to exist, right? What do you have to, and like teaching has helped me like really center this, because I will get into a mode as an artist sometimes where I'm like, oh, what, am I just being selfish? Why do I have to like focus on my work and what I have to say? Who cares? And then a student will come and say, am I just being selfish? And I'll say, absolutely not. Like every human being deserves to make art. It is your birthright. You don't have to prove it. Everyone gets to do it. And it's outside of capitalism. And so it helps me say that to myself too, to be saying that to them so often that you just get to do it. You just get to do it and you get to make what you feel called to make. And like, it's something I'm gonna have to probably keep forgetting and remembering in a cycle forever, because it's so easy to get into this, what is this for? And sometimes even the desire to have political impact, the valid desire to have political impact can sidetrack me into a capitalistic sense of what is this for? And it like religious services, right? Like we don't really know what it's for, but it does something. It does something for us as humans, and we need it, and we need to make it, and we need to see it. So even if I don't understand why we need it, it's of great inherent value.
Indeed. That's a beautiful note to end on, actually. For those of us, for those of you, I should say, who are in our audience, as you know, there will be more conversations from the Alcove. Please follow the series. If you didn't catch the first 2 seasons, there's plenty there to see, interact with, engage with. So many wonderful artists are thinking about deeply about their practice and just thinking about the beautiful thing that we make, which is theater and performance, and how the different ways that we can make it, which is like also part of its beauty. As always, I usually end recording and wave goodbye, but I will stay online afterwards with Savannah, who's been a wonderful guest today. Thank you so much, Savannah, for being here.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
Hey, hello everyone. See you next on the Conversations from the Alcove.